Get the recording started. Yes, and today it is true. We are on chapter 14. And we're opening up a new part, a new section of the book, part 4. So chapter 14 is titled The Self. And the self is really uh I think safe to say it's the crown jewel of Jung's theories, of his philosophy. Um, there's a footnote that I ran across in one of the collected works, and I had it saved. I'm just going to read it. It says, the inference would seem to be that every individual, by virtue of having or being a psyche, is potentially the self. It is only a question of realizing it, but this realization, if ever achieved, is the work of a lifetime. And so it's safe to say that the book, The Shadow of a Figure of Light, up to this point has really been trying to lay the groundwork for this concept of the self. And then from here we can start to incorporate it more in our conversation about spirituality. So it is, I want to emphasize this. It would be impossible to overstate the importance of this idea, of this topic, the self. A friend of mine read the manuscript. He's got a PhD and stuff, so I was really happy to get his feedback. And his feedback to me was, when he was reading the book, that by the time he got to this chapter, it seemed to really pick up, right? So if there's a criticism, it's that the good stuff is all sort of packed into the back of the book. And I think that the reason is because this is where we pick up the conversation about the self. And so all of the things we've talked about up to this point are going to start to sort of click and kind of probably, hopefully, make more sense. I'll do my best to give this material the sort of, you know, the respect and the conversation that it deserves. Although it's probably over my head and over out of my beyond my pay grade to do so. You know what I mean? It's such a profound concept. So, and like I said, this brings us to part 4, the ego and the self. We can't understand the self unless we also understand Jung's conception of the ego and of egohood. And so we're going to be looking at these two things kind of simultaneously. Um, and I want to say this kind of as we launch here, is that very possibly we are going to encounter some material that's difficult to accept. So I want to sort of reiterate kind of what is said in the set aside prayer, right? That we can set aside everything we think we know. Um, because I personally have seen people resist this concept of the ego and the self, and so they really can't really get past kind of a certain level, right? And so I want to kind of reiterate what Bill Wilson and Carl Jung have said, right? That we want to set aside our prejudices when it comes to these spiritual terms, because the term ego and self, both of them, are actually, they're spiritual words, right? And they're metaphors, right? And so, yeah, and so the thing is that some of this information may actually go contrary to what some of yours and my own favorite spiritual teachers have to say. And so and so this becomes quite challenging, I think, to really be able to fully kind of understand and accept this stuff. And yet my invitation would be that we take these concepts, the way I'm going to present them, through with help from Carl Jung, Edward Edinger, and Joseph Campbell, and that we sort of try them on, right? Take them for a test drive for a couple weeks or a month or so, and just see how they end up fitting and how they feel, right? Because this, and just the phrase right here is starting out: the ego is here and now. This, for example, is actually contrary to what some of my favorite spiritual teachers have taught, right? So I used to really enjoy listening to Eckhart Tolle, and his whole thing was that the ego is the thing that keeps me from experiencing the here and now, right? And so right away we're sort of hit with this controversy, right? And so a lot of what we have to do as we go through this material is really kind of pull the layers back on what these terms are and what they mean, right? And so And as we do so, we can get to sort of this underlying kind of psychological conception of spirituality, which I think if you've stuck with me up to this point, you can see at least some value in such a pursuit. So the first paragraph gives us, so in each section, I try to open with some history, right? Because we do so much talking about theory, and this sort of brings us back to real life for a minute. And so this is kind of the history section. This is the first paragraph in chapter 14. This is what it says. After the conference at Clark University in 1909, during the years leading up to the discovery of his personal myth in Taos and Africa, Jung embarked upon an in-depth examination of the Upanishads, comparing it with the writings of William James and Meister Eckhart, his two most beloved gurus. Already keenly familiar with the problem of opposites that permeates the human condition, the lack of wholeness in the Western God image prompted Jung to reimagine the higher power, just as Bill Wilson did following his own spiritual trajectory. Stephen Herman points out in Doorways to the Self that Jung could sense the birth of a new God concept brewing in the Western psyche, an image of which emerged out of his simultaneous readings of the Upanishads, Eckhart, and James. Jung longed for a conception of God that could contain the powerful energies emanating from the unconscious, a suitable symbol of the fusion of the pairs of opposites that might empower him to function in society without shutting out the primitive, just as he would encourage Jaime to seek a short time later. By the time Jung met Jaime, he had already introduced just such a notion in his two essays on analytical psychology, published in 1917, now volume 7 of his collected works. Herman tells us that Jung felt inspired to introduce a figure that would unite the Eastern conception of divinity, Brahman, the breath of life, with the relative God image that his intellectual heroes had cultivated, William James and Meister Eckhart, who led him to Spiritus, or the breath of life. And he, Jung, decided to name it the self. And so, once again, you know, what we're coming back to is this idea that we really explored in the first part, and really all the way up until now, right? Which is that the transformation process, the psychic change from the Jungian perspective, boils down to the transformation of the God image. And this is an archetypal process, right? Meaning that we all experiencing it both individually as well as collectively. So, and as we look over the history, it's very interesting that we can look at our own psychological development and then understand the psychological development of the human race, because these two things mirror each other. And so as we look back over history, we see that as consciousness expands, the God image evolves and becomes actually more and more human, which is quite paradoxical, but that's really the essence of kind of what we're going to be talking about in these next few chapters. You know, and it as the phrase that could just sort of accompany us along this journey is "as above, so below," which is I think it's an old Gnostic kind of you know, quip that just explains kind of the universe, right? And so we talk about the transformation of the God image, and Bill Wilson, he also underwent such a transformation, right? And we see in his writings how his God image evolves. It starts out as the Tsar of Heaven, quickly becomes the universal mind, and then later, a couple years later, he's writing about God consciousness and an unsuspected inner resource, right? And then it even evolves further as we go along with Wilson. Jung called his conception of the God image the self. And this is a loaded term, especially within the context of the transformation of the God image, right? Because if the God image is what Jung said is the God image is sort of the crowning symbol of the self, then it's very interesting to consider that as the self changes, the God image changes, and vice versa, right? If we're speaking about transformation of self, then calling the God image the self is a really, really kind of telling phrase. But if you're familiar with Eastern religion, then you'll recognize the phrase the self, right? Because that comes from some Eastern philosophies as well. And Jung also actually pulled some of that from William James, also, who uses the term self, and he speaks of the divided self and sort of uniting the self, right? And so I want to talk about where this sort of comes in terms of like, the theological development, right? So last session we talked about how when Jesus, right, the archetype, whatever, but kind of burst on the earth, what happens there in this sort of collective consciousness is that the God image is now split, right? It was one God, and then the God had a child, and so this God image becomes two. And what accompanies this split, right? This demonstrates a split in the psyche, right? Because the God image is a reflection of what's taking place on the inside. And so there's a split in the psyche, right? And the opposites of the cosmos sort of constellate into human experience and into human mythology. And what we start talking about then is these insoluble dilemmas, right? Good and evil, mind and matter, light and dark, heaven and hell, Satan and God, right? And and what Jung tells us is that the reason that this archetype spread so rapidly is because it was actually a depiction of the self, which is sort of this new thing that bursts onto the scene. It says, this is Jung. He says, it was the archetype of the self in the soul of every man that responded to the Christian message, with the result that the concrete Rabbi Jesus was rapidly assimilated by the constellated archetype. In this way, Christ realized the idea of the self. But as one can never distinguish empirically between a symbol of the self and a God image, the two ideas, however much we try to differentiate them, always appear blended together, so that the self appears synonymous with the inner Christ of the Johannine and Pauline writings, and Christ with God, of one substance with the Father, just as the Atman appears as the individualized self and at the same time as the animating principle of the cosmos, and Tao as a condition of mind and at the same time as the correct behavior of cosmic events. Psychologically speaking, the domain of gods begins where consciousness leaves off, for at that point, man is already at the mercy of the natural order, whether he thrive or perish. So in other words, these opposites are constellated, right? It's like humankind sort of grows to the point where they now are aware of these great opposites, and what emerges then is this archetype of the self, which is an image of wholeness and which is the ideal of this fusion of opposites that we've been talking about for all these weeks. So, the archetype of the self, and what Jung just told us, is that it is identical with the God image, meaning that the God image is a projection of the self into a mythological symbol. This is how Edinger describes this. Jung's discovery can be summed up in his one lapidary sentence: Christ exemplifies the archetype of the self. Once the meaning of that sentence is truly understood, the whole conflict of our age between scientific secular humanism and traditional religion is resolved. In one stroke, traditional Christianity has been redeemed from irrelevance to the modern mind. The vast body of Christian dogma, disputation, commentary, and heresy that has extended for 20 centuries can now be understood as the painful, tortuous workings of the collective unconscious, as it strives to bring the divine drama of the evolving God image into human consciousness. And that sort of summarizes this process, right? That we kind of can look at over history, that as these opposites emerge, then this God image emerges, and that the God image is so Jung says that the God image is not the equivalent of the self, but is rather its most immediate and profound symbol. So with that, we jump in to a phrase, a paragraph in Shadow of a Figure of Light, where because the way I look at the self then is I use the archetype of the alcoholic as sort of a mirror, right? To kind of refract aspects of the self, because they share many things in common, which we'll see. So this is what I say. Unlike a conventional notion of Western deity, the self is an image of wholeness, and as such presupposes a conjunction of the opposites. So last week we talked a lot about how the idea of Christ, or not the idea of Christ, but that Christ as a mythological symbol and as a God image really only inhabits one side of this polarity, right? And Jung didn't like that so much, right? Because as we saw last week, in the end, it proved to be sort of incomplete. And it doesn't really get people into a full kind of conjunction of the opposites. So that's what I'm referring to here. It says, in Ion, where Jung more fully fleshed out the concept of the self, he writes, in the empirical self, light and shadow form a paradoxical unity, while in the Christian concept, on the other hand, the archetype is hopelessly split in two. Wholeness is the birth of the self. An expression of the same primordial energies that make up the alcoholic archetype, the self is a fundamental psychological construct, a cornerstone upon which human consciousness rests. A personification of the collective unconscious, the self sits opposite the ego, which Jung tells us is the point of reference for the field of consciousness, explaining that we are aware of things only as far as they are related to the ego, since the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The ego is thus the mechanism in the human psyche through which we relate to everything we are conscious of, making up our subjective identity. So here's where now we bring in, so we're looking at the self, which is this paradoxical image that's like, beyond, it's transcendent to human consciousness, right? And that's juxtaposed to this psychic complex that we call the ego. And so there's this fundamental difference. And I think it's perhaps an oversimplification, right? But we say that what I'm saying here, what Jung taught, was that the ego is essentially the mechanism through which the human being, including the psyche, experiences the world, right? Jung says that wholeness is the birth of the self, and in simplified terms, that means that this conscious entity called the ego, and again, we have to put aside all of the ideas that we have about the ego. Whatever you brought to this lecture thinking about the ego, it may not fit to these definitions. I want to reiterate that, but basically the birth of the self means that the unconscious component of the psyche, which is personified by the self, when that becomes conscious, that is called the birth of the self, or self-realization. And if we go back to the 12 steps, when we say in step 11 that we sought to improve our conscious contact with the God image, what that means, it's just such a profoundly accurate statement, right? Because it's fundamentally, Carl Jung had arrived at the same conclusion, right? That the spiritual transformation boils down to the conscious ego becoming more conscious of the unconscious self. So from the psychological perspective, then, the relationship between the ego and the self is the premise of every single mythology. And that really is the key through which we can learn to sort of translate this Jungian theory, right? And luckily, the same thing takes place in the steps. So this is what it says in The Shadow of a Figure of Light. The dynamic taking place between the ego and the self, or between consciousness and the unconscious, forms the psychological basis of all Western myth, including the 12 steps. From such a perspective, the human characters typify the ego, the carrier of consciousness. And whenever the symbol of God is present, it is representative of the self, the central autonomous psychic complex. The ego extends as far as the limits of one's individual consciousness, but the self comprises the totality of the psyche, so it includes both conscious and the unconscious. Thus, the part of the self that is conscious is called ego, but the self extends well beyond the horizon of consciousness, incorporating the individual shadow, and from there, reaching into the unfathomable depths of the collective unconscious. Therefore, the self encompasses the ego, and yet remains almost entirely unknown and unknowable. As such, the self is a power greater than the ego, indistinguishable from the God image in myth. All right, so that's kind of a technical phrase, just to, I wanted to be really accurate when I wrote this, but essentially we can just say that, so the total being is the self, right? Including the unconscious as well as consciousness, right? Like, we are the self. The part of the self that is conscious is called the ego, right? And the idea is then that we grow the ego, right? And that the ego grows, right, by making more of the unconscious conscious, which is the fundamental kind of process of all spiritual and psychological growth, including the 12 steps. And so, and it was important to me because once I saw that the 12 steps also depicts the relationship between the ego and the self, then the whole thing really opened up and I was able to really formulate a lot of these ideas, right? So in other words, the 12 steps are depicting the same divine drama that the other myths depict, where the ego is sort of trapped and is being driven by this autonomous psychic complex, right? And that autonomous psychic complex is called the self. And in the 12 steps, we essentially can attribute the self to both the alcoholic mind, or that power that drives us while we're trapped in step one, to the higher power of step two, right? Which is also, it's the flip side, right? So many times up to now, we've spoken of these archetypes in terms of the lowest and the highest. And now we have the archetype of all archetypes, which is the self. And the self encompasses all the same attributes of all the other archetypes. And so then in terms of the 12 steps, we have the lowest, that alcoholic mind, right? And then we have the highest, which is the higher power, okay? And essentially encompasses everything in between. So basically then, what we're dealing with here, so I really want to flesh out this kind of this problem that we have, right? Because what's happened, I think, in the West is that a lot of us have sort of unknowingly adopted an Eastern conception of the ego. And so we get confused about how this in the West, how we can understand the relationship between the ego and the self. And again, this will go against a lot of things we hear in the meetings and read in our books of our favorite teachers, right? But there's something to be mined here. And so we want to look at this with an open mind. So the conflict really boils down to these two different worldviews, right? This vast difference between living as an Eastern person in the East and living as a Western person in the West. And the fundamentally so we covered a lot of this in the early part of the book, but we're revisiting it now in terms within the context of the ego and the self, because it should probably start to make more sense. I've said over and over that as the ego develops, the mythological systems also develop at the same time. And so as consciousness develops out here in the conscious world, the outer world, there's similar transitions taking place on the inside, and those are represented through the transformations of these mythological images. And so this is why, as a Westerner, the Western myths are they're sort of more attuned to speak to our innermost selves versus an Eastern myth. So Joseph Campbell helps us to kind of break down these two separate views of spirituality, and we're going to look at him for a couple slides. This is what he says. The East Indian term yoga is derived from the Sanskrit verbal root yuj, to link, join, or unite, which is related etymologically to yoke, as in a yoke of oxen, and is in this sense analogous to the word religion, Latin religio, which is to link back or bind. Man, the creature, is by religion bound back to God. However, religion, religio, refers to a linking historically conditioned by way of a covenant, sacrament, or Quran, whereas yoga, the Eastern perspective, is the psychological linking of the mind to that superordinated principle by which the mind knows. Furthermore, in yoga, what is linked is finally the self to itself, consciousness to consciousness. For what had seemed through Maya to be two are in reality not so. Maya means illusion. Whereas in religion, what are linked are God and man, which are not the same. So to break that down some more, fundamentally what it means is that in the West, our myths are telling us about this story that took place in the Garden of Eden, that God made man out of the elements, right? And that God and man are not the same. And that there was a fall and that man became corruptible, right? And then this split takes place between spirit and matter. And so and then this is the worldview that the Western psyche is born into, that it is not the same as its creator. In the East, the creation myth fundamentally in the East is that there was this one entity, this thing, whatever it is, and that it realized that it was by itself, and so it split into two. And then those two split into two, and those split into two, and essentially creation came about through this single entity splitting itself into all of the other creatures in the universe. And so fundamentally, by nature, those things are divine, right? And so this difference, this fundamental difference in our views of spirituality, is that in the West, the whole goal is to get back into the presence of God, whom we were separated from. Whereas in the East, the teaching is that we're not actually separated, we only think we are. So, and whether we believe, so and this is a really subtle point, but whether we believe in these like we might say, oh, well, then I must have an Eastern perspective or whatever, that's fine. But fundamentally, though, still in our kind of programming, right, this is how we see the world. And so this is where Jung comes in, and Jung explains how we get at the Eastern perspective by going inside of ourselves, right? And so we don't have to adopt an Eastern viewpoint, but that if we search hard enough within ourselves, we're going to find that essentially the same, kind of almost the same fundamental belief, but we get there through a more a clearer channel, right? But it's just it's difficult to get there because this stuff is really heady. I trust me, I know it. I so moving on then, underlying this controversy, right, is the role that the ego plays in the within the two worldviews. Um, and this is where we get confused because the ego is seen differently in each kind of perspective, right? So and so let's see, this is what Campbell says about this. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything in my notes here. So and the myths are going to speak to this sort of ego's role in this whole process, right? The Eastern myths speak differently than the Western myths. So and this is a really kind of a cultural difference that we can see in movies, in books, and everything. But this is where Campbell explains the difference between the two views of the ego. Here, I believe, is a point of fundamental importance for our understanding of the basic difference between the Oriental and the Occidental approaches to the cultivation of the soul. In the Indian myth, or the Eastern myth, the principle of ego is identified completely with the pleasure principle. Whereas in the psychology of Jung, its proper function is to know and relate to external reality, Freud's reality principle. Not the reality of the metaphysical, but that of the physical, empirical sphere of time and space. In other words, spiritual maturity, as understood in the modern West, requires a differentiation of the ego, whereas in the Orient, throughout the history, at least of every teaching that has stemmed from India, ego is impugned as the principle of delusion to be dissolved. So recall from an earlier slide, Jung said that the ego is here and now. For Jung, and it's very important here, Campbell was a genius in terms of world religions. And when he's defining mature Western spirituality, he only goes to Jung, because Jung was the guy who really bridged the gap between East and West, using Western myth to do so. Campbell tells us that the Western ego needs to be differentiated. Also, it needs to be individuated. This is while you hear me use the word individuation all the time, right? That the quest we're on as Westerners is diametrically opposed to the quest that an Eastern disciple will go on, right? In the West, the ego is an entity that's trapped in this collective, right? And the ego is this hyper rational, rationalistic, and personal kind of subjective experience, right? And if we look at this the right way, what we see is that here in the West, the ego is actually the victim. And it's the ego's trapped between these opposites, right? That are expressed, that they express in myth, but the opposites that just exist in nature. The ego is sort of trapped in between those, and is stuck in this enantiodromic swing back and forth between from one extreme to the other, identifying with one and then the other ad infinitum, right? That's the illusion or the Maya that's taking place in the West, right? Whereas in the East, the Maya is just that, Campbell says that the ego is associated only with the pleasure principle. And so healthy spiritual growth there is simply to work on sort of diminishing the ego, right? And yeah, it's very interesting, right? So healthy spiritual growth in the West involves strengthening the ego, whereas in the East, it involves sort of diminishing and trying to actually abolish the ego. Jung says over and over in his collected works that, it wouldn't be a really good idea for a Western person to abolish their ego, because then there wouldn't be anything there to notice that a change had occurred. And that really is a fundamental kind of Western like perspective, right? Whereas that is the goal in the East. The goal in the East is essentially to lay down and go to sleep for eternity. That is heaven in the East. Whereas in the West, it's like this it's the complete opposite, right? It's like, no, I'm going to wake up in a new world and go to heaven, and it's going to be me. It's going to look like me. I'm going to retain my individuality, but I'm going to be happy forever and ever. So this is the two fundamental kind of differences in our mythologies. Now, that's why the underlying purposes of our spiritual programs aren't the same. And in the West, and then this is sort of where Jung comes in and kind of defines the relationship that, and this goes back to his own myth, right? Was that in the West, the self needs the ego. Jung says that the self, that he says the God wants to become human, right? Like that like if you study all of the myths from Western culture, like there's this kind of clear distinction that God wants to become human, and with each manifestation, the God image becomes more and more and more human. And then I've pointed out that even in tradition too, that God is so human now that the only place to find him is in a business meeting, right? Which is the biggest paradox of all. But that essentially, though, for the God image to become human, it needs the ego, right? And this is what Campbell explains. In the West, we celebrate a secular spirituality sustained by self-responsible individuals acting not in terms of general laws supposed to represent the will or way of some personal God or impersonal eternity, but each in terms of his own developing realization of worth. Such an idea is distinctly and uniquely European. In the East, one attains release from the destiny of this body and its deluding attachments to this world. And the reincarnating monad, which is it's like that point of consciousness that sort of inhabits each of our bodies, right? In the East, that the reincarnating monad then dissolves, as Ramakrishna says, like a salt doll that has walked into the ocean of the cosmic self, Brahmatan, which is at once the nothing and the all. So, in other words, yeah, so I think I've done a pretty good job explaining this fundamental difference, right? That there's these two worldviews, and that what we're trying to do as we look at our own spiritual growth with our own myths and our own symbols is look at it from to try to really use Jung's perspective and adopt his conception of the ego. And just to reiterate, the ego then is the vehicle of consciousness, right? In other words, everything I experience right here in this world, like this is my ego, right? And it's not good or bad. It just is. It's just the mechanism of experiencing the world. Whereas the self then is everything in the unconscious. Now, let's see here. Oh, switch. So the ego, again, the ego's relationship to the self is the basis, really forms the basis of every spiritual path, right? And once you see it, then it's really quite easy to see. And we're going to go through some examples over the next couple of weeks of like how this plays out in myth. And while in the West we don't want to demonize the ego, right? The whole idea is to kind of help the ego and help the ego grow and to wake it up. But that doesn't mean we want to overlook the weaknesses that the ego has, its weaknesses and its limitations. And so when we talk about differentiating the ego, then we begin to kind of look at this as this process of helping the ego, right? And so this paragraph just describes how the ego relates to the self from birth. And I'm going to pull in some Edinger stuff here. So, and because, and I'm going to touch on this later, but in Jungian thought, there's sort of like two halves of life, right? There's the first half and the second half. And then there's this point in the middle that's just called like the middle part of life where a crisis takes place. And that the first half of life is to strengthen the ego, while the second half of life is then to use the ego to help to make the self conscious. So that's sort of the trajectory we're looking at now. So we talk about the inflated ego. At base, the psychic change we seek through spiritual transformation represents a shift in the way the conscious ego relates to the unconscious superordinate self. When we're born, we don't have an ego. It grows out of the self as we come of age. Edward Edinger explained that in earliest infancy, no ego or consciousness exists. All is in the unconscious. The latent ego is in complete identification with the self. The self is born, but the ego is made, and in the beginning, all is self. As the ego emerges, it naturally identifies as being one with the self, the way an infant relates to its mother. An ego that unconsciously identifies with the self is called an inflated ego, a state that persists into adulthood, especially among alcoholics and addicts. Edinger writes that for the inflated ego, its total being and experience are ordered around the a priori assumption of a deity. An ego that is still identified with the self believes that it is both all-knowing and all-powerful, the smartest person in the room, as we hear in 12-step meetings. Bill Wilson intuited a similar problem for the alcoholic ego, writing that we had to quit playing God, it didn't work. Wilson recognized that most people live by self-propulsion. Each person is like an actor who wants to run the whole show, is forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, and the rest of the players in his own way. If his arrangements would only stay put, if only people would do as he wished, the show would be great. Everybody, including himself, would be pleased. Life would be wonderful. So having introduced this idea of playing God, right, I just want to highlight that that's what we're talking about here in terms of this ego development. This is what I say as commentary. Indeed, whenever we find ourselves attempting to control any person, place, or thing, we act from an a priori assumption of a deity, as Edinger says. Wilson goes on to explain that the alcoholic especially is a victim of the delusion that he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if he only manages well. The delusion of control one experiences with regards to alcohol or drugs epitomizes every inflated ego that feigns more influence than it actually has. Deep down, all of us secretly assume that our savvy alone makes us best equipped to manage the outcome of every situation, yours or mine, when in reality, the ego has very little sway over much of anything in life, often unable to control even the very next thought or action. Jung says that the ego is driven to act, yet free to reflect. It is the unconscious self, the inner empirical deity, who is actually running the show. All the ego can do is reflect upon and bravely accept that fact, as suggested in the first 3 steps. So we're really starting to pile on this information now, right? And the way I've kind of spelled this out for myself is really, it kind of all hinges on this delusion of control, right? And that the ego, and we have such a great example of this process in our own experience in the 12 steps, right? And whether you're an alcoholic, a drug addict, you love food, whatever it is, that the ego experiences this delusion of control over this thing, right? And that really the spiritual process really begins, I guess, when the ego comes to recognize that delusion. And so step 1, the whole process hinges on this recognition, right? Where the ego becomes conscious that it's suffering from a delusion of control. This is an essentially Jungian concept. It's also a 12-step concept. So we're right at home here in these ideas. So Jungians, they usually split the arc of life into two stages, right? There's these two stages of life. And essentially what happens in the first stage is that the ego emerges out of the self, right? Recall Edinger says when we're born, there is no ego. The ego kind of grows out of the self, right? And then as the ego matures, it comes up to this midlife crisis. And that's typically the time, and the whole kind of goal of the first half of life is to strengthen the ego so that when that midlife crisis comes, the ego's strong enough to survive it. Because what happens when the ego kind of hits this midlife crisis is that it sort of awakens to this fact that it doesn't actually run the show, that there's a supraordinate psychological entity that's in charge. And that could be the alcoholic mind, it can be the God image, whatever it is, but it's something, whatever it is, it's reflective of the self, right? And then the second half of life is that a person learns to turn towards the self and then begin to express the self and help the self to become conscious. So that's how the arc of life is separated in terms of this Jungian thought. We see this a lot in the 12 steps. So for example, my story is that in the first half of life, like I spent drinking and using and probably strengthening my ego to a certain extent. But that the midlife crisis for me was actually when I hit bottom with drugs and alcohol at 34 years old. That's when I had this big kind of aha moment. And what I say is that the objective psyche held up a mirror and I could finally see myself for exactly who I'd become. And that was sort of that midlife crisis for me. Also, though, what we see a lot in the steps is that people who get sober at a younger age, sometimes they'll have what is called a second surrender. Very often it's called that, where with 10 or 15 years or 5 or 6 years or whatever it is, in their mid-30s, usually, they come up against a second surrender or something else besides drugs and alcohol, essentially just eats their lunch. And they go through this midlife crisis, right? Where they wake up to the fact that, oh, it's not just drugs and alcohol, it's actually something else in me that I can't control. So, and this all kind of, falls into the way Jung kind of spelled it out. So this is what Edinger says. In the early stages of ego development, the opposites must be separated, and you might say that it is the task of the ego in the first half of life to get out of them. Then, if psychic development is to proceed, that split-off shadow figure must be encountered as an inner reality. See that autonomous psychic complex, when the ego realizes, wow, there's something else that's running the show. Then one is confronted with the problem of bringing the opposites together as opposed to separating them. Separating the opposites is a task for the early part of life, and the union of the opposites is a task for the later part of life. And as we go, we'll see how it's really the self that is the author of this whole kind of drama, because the self is the personification of the opposites. This paragraph right here is in the book, and this is how Edinger describes the inflated ego, and I just think it fits so well with our 12-step conception that I put it in. This is what Edinger says. There are numerous examples of inflation, which we might call the inflation of everyday life. We can identify a state of inflation whenever we see someone, including ourselves, living out an attitude of deity, whenever one is transcending proper human limits. Spells of anger are examples of inflated states. The attempt to force and coerce one's environment is the predominant motivation in anger. It is a kind of Yahweh complex. The urge to vengeance is also identification with deity. At such times, one might recall the injunction, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, i.e., not yours. Power motivations of all kinds are symptomatic of inflation. Whenever one operates out of a power motive, omnipotence is implied. So remember, we're going back to this concept of playing God here, right? And so Edinger is kind of describing all the different ways we play God, or in Jungian terms, when we identify or unconsciously identify with the self. Whenever one operates out of a power motive, omnipotence is applied. But omnipotence is an attribute only of God. Intellectual rigidity, which attempts to equate its own private truth or opinion with universal truth, is also inflation. It is the assumption of omniscience. Lust and all operations of the pure pleasure principle are likewise inflation. Any desire that considers its own fulfillment the central value transcends the reality limits of the ego and hence is assuming attributes of transpersonal powers, in other words, playing God. Practically all of us, deep down, have a residue of inflation that is manifested as immortality. There is scarcely anyone that is thoroughly and totally disidentified with this aspect of inflation. Taking on oneself too much of anything is also indicative of inflation because it transcends proper human limits. Too much humility as well as too much arrogance, too much love and altruism as well as too much power striving and selfishness are all symptoms of inflation. So in the spiritual process then begins with the ego sort of waking up to this thing, right? That it's been identified with the self or identified as playing God. It thinks it's God. And what I call this is the delusion of control. Obviously, there's other 12 steppers who call it that. I know Rami talks about the delusion of control in his book, in one of his books. And that's the way we sort of frame it, right? Is the delusion of control. I was also really tickled to stumble upon Ettinger's phrase, the assumption of omniscience, right? That's also this sort of delusion of control. It's kind of the same thing. It's this idea of playing God or managing well. James Hollis has a phrase that's equally, telling, which is that the ego suffers from an illusion or a delusion of sovereignty, right? Meaning that it thinks that it's got all this power and control when it actually doesn't. Like it's this that it's sovereign over, and it's very interesting if you look at it, it's like how often during the day are we really not being driven, right? That we're really like wide awake and being purely conscious of everything we're doing. Like it's actually very seldom. So we sort of get into these adaptive modes and we just kind of go along. We just go along with life, right? And meanwhile, what's happening is that the autonomous psychic complex called the self is running the show. And so this really is the kind of the nuts and bolts of the spiritual walk. And as we go, we talk about, so the first half of life is to separate the opposites, right? To become conscious of good and evil, right? To partake of the forbidden fruit, right? Which we'll talk about next week. The second half of life then is the conjunction of opposites, right? To fuse the opposites and bring them back together. But in order to fuse the opposites, they have to be clearly separated, right? And in order to clearly separate the opposites, they have to be experienced. Right? We can't just read about this stuff. We actually have to go and experience it. And another phrase for this sort of conjunction, right, or individuation or differentiation of the ego is self-realization, which really boils down to the expansion of consciousness, right? Or the process of making the unconscious conscious. Again, it really, step one is just such a profound concept because it sort of encompasses this whole drama, right? But that we suffer from a delusion of control, that it's this unconscious complex that drives us, and that our freedom and deliverance from sort of everything that ails us really hinges on our ability to see that delusion. And to see the delusion is to make the unconscious conscious. That is the essence of self-realization. If the self is a personification of the unconscious, right, then self-realization is to realize the self or to become aware, consciously aware of the unconscious. So once again, it's step 11. It's also step 1. And this is what I say in the book, Expanding Spiritual Consciousness. As the center of the field of consciousness, the ego filters our perceptions of the world, acting and reacting on the stage of life, unaware that the self, the inner empirical deity, is the producer, director, playwright, and audience of the drama that we are forever caught up in. William James recognized this higher order of things as well, explaining that a religious attitude consists in the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. The process of self-realization involves the ego learning to recognize that this unseen order stems from an unknown, transcendent aspect of one's own psyche, distinct from itself. In order for the ego to properly adjust in its relationship to that inner deity, it must relinquish its delusion of control or its assumption of omniscience and omnipotence, coming to realize that a supraordinate, autonomous psychic complex is actually in charge, driving us to think, say, and do things that are beyond our control. So we're going back to chapter 11 here, right? With the trickster archetype and the alcoholic mind. So all of these things we've talked about up until now are really kind of just representations of the self. And so we're really just using a different sort of symbol to describe the same phenomenon. The way we disidentify from the self is by shining the light of consciousness on the shadowy contents of our psyche, beginning with the unseen compulsions behind what often turns out to be self-destructive behavior. And while such a course of action might sound easy, it's not. For the inflated ego doesn't just decide to let go of its pretense of transpersonal power. That goes against every survival mechanism the human psyche has carefully evolved since the dawn of time. The ego has to be thoroughly convinced through a tedious process that almost always involves an insoluble psychological dilemma. Thus, the self methodically deconstructs the ego's delusion of control by leading it into a psychological trap it cannot spring, of which the adventure of the anonymous alcoholic is a spiritual prototype. Step 1 depicts the deflation of the ego, the psycho-spiritual death whereby the ego relinquishes its assumption of omniscience and finally admits it is powerless. Then the self can start guiding the ego toward greater self-realization, toward a spiritual rebirth and reawakening symbolized in the remaining 11 steps. And so really, I think what's highlighted here is just that this sort of intuitive understanding we have of spirituality and of the psychic change, the spiritual awakening, that it really is at base. It really is a Jungian myth, right? That's not to say that the 12 steps grew out of Jung's own personal myth, though they sort of sprouted together and they run parallel, right? But what it does say is that the process that we're engaged in here in the 12 steps is an archetypal process, that it really kind of gets to the point of psychic transformation in every different culture, right? And that these two systems, Jungian thought as well as 12-step ideology, they're both these psychological processes, right? And they're both sort of getting at the same thing. Which is conscious contact with the unconscious. The archetype. So, and when we talk about this delusion of sovereignty or this delusion of control, it really does get back to the archetype of the alcoholic, right? The archetype of the alcoholic and just the adventure of the anonymous alcoholic. In other words, my adventure, your adventure, right? Our process of getting to the rooms and then of getting through the door and then waking up spiritually is really, we don't have to look much further to understand what this process is all about. We've all, lived it or are living through it right now. What I write is this: Wilson's character is useful for understanding ego inflation and deflation, for the harrowing cycle that alcoholics pass through on their way toward the rooms is one that everyone experiences to one degree or another as they grow towards self-realization. As we all endure an unconscious thirst for union with God, so we all suffer from a delusion of control over something or someone, illustrated by the alcoholic belief that the next drink will be the one that finally makes them feel whole. And just as the drinking career of alcoholics is an integral aspect of the arc of their spiritual journey, leading them to the wellspring of life, all of our unconscious reactions, triggered by our assumptions of omniscience, represent doorways that open directly into the unconscious, setting us on the path to enlightenment. If we're lucky, we'll recognize with Wilson that lack of power was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously, but where and how were we to find this power? In reality, that most important question itself represents an insoluble dilemma, for the answer lies beyond the ego's grasp. A dilemma that is so confounding that it can awaken the ego from its state of unconscious inflation will require the self who authored it to solve. That is why they say in 12-step meetings, unironically, that our best thinking got us here. Working the 12 steps, individuals quickly learn that the process they have embarked upon is designed to right-size the ego. In Jungian terms, the steps help to realign the ego in its relationship to the self, the same process symbolized in every myth, but perhaps most brilliantly outlined by Wilson's first 3 suggestions. We admitted we were powerless, that our lives had become unmanageable. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And then I don't have the third one. It got cut off. So in chapter 11, we saw that it was the trickster who masterminds this debacle, right? That leads to the alcoholic's demise, right? And that the whole basis of that kind of mess is so that the ego will awaken to its powerlessness, right? That it'll come to recognize that it is driven to act and yet free to reflect. And what we're going to be looking at in the chapters that come after this really is we're going to break down this ego self relationship like more and more and more. But that what happens here is that the shadow, our own shadow, right? That individual kind of unconscious thing that's really close. It's just right here, right behind us, right? That shadow is really the doorway into the self. So when we talk about, that enlightenment comes by making the darkness conscious, we really start doing that with our own shadow, right? That our own darkness that's not really that hard to see if we just have a good sponsor or a good therapist or a good wife or something, it's pretty easy to see the shadow and to get our fingers on it and to recognize where it's kind of dominating, right? And then from there, if we just keep going into the darkness, then we just uncover more and more. And eventually what we get down to is the archetype of the self. And what I just touched on here was Wilson's own conception. So Wilson created this, this kind of journey, right, for the anonymous alcoholic. But what we see from Wilson's letter to Jung in 1961 was that he had his own sort of pretty spot on conception of this whole process and the role of the ego, as well as these insoluble psychological dilemmas that Jung talks about. And I want to briefly touch on that because, Wilson really he got so many of us to see the light in this stuff, just in his own way. And it's really profound. This is what I say, just winding down the chapter. In the letter Wilson wrote to Jung in January of 1961, he described ego deflation within the context of his own recovery, telling Jung that his stern warning to Roland about the hopelessness of his chances for recovery from alcoholism was the very thing that spurred Roland to seek spiritual help. Wilson commented that he had been given a similar message from Dr. Silkworth with an equally profound impact, repeating an idea he gleaned from his study in early sobriety of William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience. Quote, "This book gave me the realization that most conversion experiences, whatever their variety, do have a common denominator of ego collapse at depth. The individual faces an impossible dilemma," end of quote. And while James never used the phrase ego collapse, Wilson, eager student as he was, mined it from the depths of the collective unconscious through his keen spiritual intuition while reading James, going on to develop it quite masterfully in the big book, the basis of his own myth of expanding consciousness. Every spiritual journey involves the tremendous polarity of our nature, railroading us into a situation that can only be solved by the terrifying experience of a psychic process that works us rather than us it. Wilson spoke to Jung of how pivotal Silkworth's verdict of hopelessness was for him in his own process of spiritual regeneration, comparing it to the message Hazard had received from Jung. To me, writes Wilson, this was a shattering blow. Just as Roland had been made ready for his conversion experience by you, so had my wonderful friend Dr. Silkworth prepared me. Such a shattering blow, which is sort of that culminating crisis in midlife, right? That took place for Bill Wilson when he got sober. Such a shattering blow marks what we call our moment of clarity, when the ego finally awakens to the reality of the dangerous web fate has laid for it. What is shattered, broken, or cut off is the ego's heartbreaking obsession that it will find some new miracle of control. That's Bill Wilson speaking of the alcoholic dilemma. Wilson's phrase, ego collapse at depth, is what Jungians call ego deflation. It is the urge towards self-realization for those of us who have been truly called by the self to embark upon such a heroic and dangerous task. The alcoholic ego, in the face of such overpowering evidence, is particularly prone to experience complete collapse because becoming thoroughly convinced that one's sense of control over much of anything in life is just an illusion. Still, recognizing one's powerless, even over alcohol or drugs, is almost as hard as it is to sense our intangible thirst for union with God. The ego resists making the connection sometimes until it is too late. And so, that wraps it up for today. We are going to talk more about the relationship between the ego and the self. We're gonna use a lot of myths to kind of flesh that out, and then we're going to talk more about doorways to self, right? And how the shadow and these other kind of unconscious components really provide the impetus for spiritual growth, and that it really boils down to making them conscious. So, yeah, hopefully there's a lot of questions today. I'm really happy that you guys stuck with me, and I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Cody. What an amazing presentation. Everyone, please unmute. You can unmute, and let's make a collective expressions of appreciation. Yay for Mr. Peterson. Yeah. Woo.
Yay.
Wow.
I guess no one can unmute.
Oh no, we've got it made so you can unmute. No?
Oh.
No.
Oh,
Yeah.
now you did.
Now you
Thank
can.
you. Thank you, Cody. Thank you,
Cody.
Cody.
So much.
Thank you.
Another awesome
Awesome.
Amazing.
tomorrow.
Thank you, Cody.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yippee,
Wow.
Yeah, once again, you
Yippee-yi-yo,
blew me away.
yippee-yi-yay.
I'm bowing.
Amazing.
even more confused.
I'm not.
Hey, that was kind of fun, the way people were not unmuted, the pressure built up, and then when the unmute came, it really came rushing out today.
I'm glad I noticed, because I was like, oh, no one's that excited. I was like, oh.
Yeah, I was just dead. I mean, this series was great for the first 13 chapters, and today, nothing.
Wah, wah, wah.
The miracle is in the
Everyone's
timing.
unmuted, but nobody's saying anything. So there.
Nobody could say anything.
Okay, so now we are coming to the time for questions and answers. Each person will have about 90 seconds to ask a question. And Cody will do his best to answer. So there's lots of hands up. I'm going to start calling on people and asking you to unmute. And please get to a question within the 90 seconds or even sooner, so we can get to more and more and more questions. So let me put 90 seconds on the clock. Come on in, Philip. I see that you're at the top of my list.
Thank you. Cody, I understand that the archetype of the alcoholic is one who has a delusion of self-control. Uh, can you give me a picture? I mean, I'm working with another psychological program that deals with parts of the personality, and I am having a difficult time coming up with a personality that, or a picture of the archetype of the alcoholic.
So yeah, no, that's thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I think that it is hard because and I'm not super familiar with the parts work. I'm just kind of only vaguely familiar, but from a Jungian perspective, the sort of the catchphrase, I guess, for all of these archetypes, but really, I mean, the archetype of the alcoholic is like more so than most, is that these are paradoxical images of wholeness. And what I mean by that is to say that and we see this in the rooms, like if you're in AA or NA or pretty much, any of the 12 step rooms, is that like if you go to an AA meeting, you're bound to hear somebody in a meeting say, "My name is George and I'm a grateful alcoholic." Right? And that's a paradox, right? Because that just doesn't make any sense. No real alcoholic would ever say that they were also a grateful alcoholic. Um, but what's happening here is that this sort of what's happened for this person um is that the that delusion of self-control, right, or that delusion of control has been transformed, right? And so and by having that gift given to them of their life being destroyed, right, by this delusion of control, that their ego is able to wake up then to a greater reality and to recognize that there's something happening in the background of the psyche that is actually beyond our control. And that one, and paradoxically, right, is that understanding that fundamental sort of problem, this human problem, really, it actually is a very empowering experience, because then it allows us this ability to not only really handle life's difficulties with more kind of, you know, awareness, I guess, but that what becomes laid out then is sort of a spiritual process that we can take that that allows us to realign our relationship with this power, whatever this power is. And that power is the self, right, in the most kind of fundamental terms. So the reason it's hard to come up with an image for the alcoholic is because it's a paradoxical image, and it's meant to be challenging, right? The ego is addicted to rationale. It's addicted to having things laid out in a way that it can fully comprehend, which is actually in direct contrast to the way the psyche works, the objective psyche, which is only deals in paradox. It only deals in these opposites, like, and so when things emerge out of the unconscious, the ego naturally will find it very difficult and unpalatable and hard to swallow and hard to understand. And so the more comfortable we can get in thinking in these paradoxical terms, the better we're going to be at sort of aligning ourselves to the unconscious self. So I don't know how that aligns with parts work, but I'm sure it does, and hopefully, in the near future I can do some research and try to get more familiar with that, because I recognize it's a powerful, system, and people are having great experiences there. So, but from a Jungian perspective, the paradox is sort of the nature of things when we're speaking of these types of images and these symbols. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Cody. Just a reminder, if you don't want to be recorded, you can put your question in the chat and I will weave it into the Q&A. Next is Drexel.
Wow, good afternoon, fellowship mates. And having recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, I'm still an alcoholic. My name is Drexel. And wow, thank you so much for your sharing your research and how you've delivered what you've gathered from it. My problem is that we have the time 18 we've got a minute and a half to share a question, so we don't really have an understanding of what we can ask in that time that we spent an hour and a half to gather and try to put together to even develop a question for without having a series of questions. Well, my problem is that the whole idea is absurd, isn't it? But it's the yin yang. So I'm from birth to not know of paradoxes and grow through life to reach this recovery we call to understanding not only that paradoxes are, but to understand their relationship and their need enough to become whole by our differences. I don't know if you got that question.
Drexel, it seems like I was only able to catch. I wasn't able to really catch what you were saying. It seems like either your service is bad or it might be my service. But
Right. Well, the connection and transmission and reception all have to do with understanding. So we'll have to try it on another venue. But I appreciate the idea of where my vibrations can be sent through to be felt. Thank you.
Thank you, Drexel. Thank you. Patrick from Cologne, or in Cologne.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Cody. Thank you, everybody, for this meeting and for that great presentation. So the couple of things struck me, and I haven't read ahead, so I don't know if I'm preempting stuff. If that's the case, you can just simply reference, cross-reference that, Cody. But the ego deflation, ego inflation, right, I think belongs to the paradigm of the ego. And the ego transcendence is the language of the solution. So would you like to comment on that? That's one thing. And the second thing is that we talk about powerlessness and so on, whereby I see that as a secondary issue. The primary issue has got to do with unmanageability, and to be able to live a sane and useful life in the face of the reality of the unmanageability, which is underlined at the latest when we take our last breath, and how you see and what role unmanageability plays in your work.
yeah, I love those. I love both of those comments. And I think that they're related. So, and the unmanageability piece becomes, I mean, it's like, so even Jung kind of speaks of unmanageability. And we see that in chapter 16 in the first paragraph, where I actually quote Jung as kind of addressing this concept of unmanageability head on and relating it to the self. And I think that, I mean, from an outside perspective, I think it would be safe to say that powerlessness and unmanageability are essentially the same thing. Whereas in the rooms, we differentiate those things because we're trying to it's just like this delusion of control is so dangerous that I have to really focus in on what exactly is causing this unmanageability, right? And for me, it was powerlessness over alcohol and drugs. So I think that those, I mean, I think it's actually, I don't know if you've noticed, Patrick, but in one of those, I quoted the first step and actually took out powerless over alcohol, just said powerless and unmanageable, because I think really, broadly speaking, those two things can essentially, not from a technical 12-step perspective, but from a psychological perspective, those two things are essentially the same. I think when it comes to, so the paradigm of the ego and then the ego's transcendence, right? We speak of ego inflation and deflation, and how that, as the childhood ego is an inflated ego, and it's even a healthy ego. Like the child should be inflated, and it should should have all of its needs met and be showered with love, right? The necessary defeat only should come later in life, right? By the self. So that one defeats oneself, right? A child shouldn't be defeated by its parents. That's not a healthy environment, right? Um, so the deflation really comes through, oneself and the way the world kind of reacts to our own inflation. So, and I think the point I'm trying to make in the book is that we speak of this sort of playing God, right? And that is, at its base, that is ego inflation, or egocentricity, whatever, we call it by a few different things. Um, and that, and and what I would want to say is that the inflated ego is the ego that unconsciously identifies with the self. And if we understand the self as this paradoxical image, so that it kind of inhabits both the light and the dark, or this bipolar kind of sphere or whatever, then what the ego is doing is essentially sort of unconsciously identifying with one side or the other of a pair of opposites, right? So it's either like hyper fixated on only the good side, or it's hyper fixated on only the bad side. And it's an unconscious sort of identification. So, and we see this in the 12 steps so often, right? Where a person will come in and they're new, and they're like, oh, I hate drinking and I hate drugs. It ruined my life. Like, I'm never going to do that again. Right. So they're unconsciously identified with the sober aspect of the alcoholic, but and through experience, right, we know that those people are very close to a slip, right? Because what we're looking for is more of a neutral place, where we're not really charged by either side of this polarity. And that would be the ego deflation, right? Where it's sort of, it just is safe and protected. So I like that. I like the use of the word transcendent there. I think it's good. But I think that the ego, I think the self is transcendent. The ego needs the power, right? Like, it's suffering from this lack of power. And interestingly, by making more of the unconscious conscious, I think the ego is sort of it's almost like it's eating the power, right? Jung talks about that these archetypes sort of have their own luminosity, and that when the ego becomes aware of them, it sort of adopts their luminosity, and so the ego itself becomes more illuminated. So I think that that's how the ego transcends. So thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Cody. We have about 7 minutes left. We have 7 questions. The audience is doing a great job at getting right to their question. Cody, I'm going to have to start timing you to get everybody in. Charlene, please come in.
Okay. Thank you. I am a grateful recovering codependent. So I think I used the word I am correctly there, to avoid that paradox. And I think I am is so powerful. So my question has to do with the word I. In German, ICH. German also has a separate word for ego, EGO. But a lot of people will translate ICH as I or ego. And I follow Rudolf Steiner, and I've noticed he never actually says the ego. He always says the I or ICH. He will say eaglehood or egoism, but never EGO. So could you comment on where the word I, not the, the I look at, but like what allows me to say versus me versus I when I'm 3 years old. I do that transformation from me to I want. Um, could you comment on that? Thank you.
Thanks, Charlene. I have to say I don't know that I can comment on that. It seems like a pretty kind of technical psychological question that I might not be cut out to comment on. However, I will say that I am struck by the phrase the word that God uses in the Old Testament, right? When he's talking to Moses, and Moses says, "Well, who should I tell people that what's your name?" Right? And the response from the deity is, "I am," right? I am. So and so I think that that's an interesting, in terms of inflation and deflation, I think it's quite telling about the process that we're engaged in, because on
Yeah.
one hand it's I am, right? I am the Godhead, and then but on the other hand it's I am as in, I am not the Godhead. So yeah, that's a
And
great question.
and it's related to step one. Uh, I I admitted I'm powerless
Uh,
versus my life has become unmanageable. So it's like kind of we admitted we were powerless, or I am powerless. My life has become unmanageable. So yes, thank you. It's
Thanks, Charlene.
oh, thanks, Charlene. No more double dipping, anybody. We're rushing to the end here. Fiona, come on in.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting all of this. Well, question. I think you might have answered it actually when you talked about neutrality, with the inflation and deflation, because I was going to say, with these strong archetypes and, God images and growing the unconscious and stuff. Sorry, somebody's coming up the stairs now, I'm getting distracted. And they're going to come in. Yes, I'm on live on Zoom. Yeah. Okay. Well, sorry. And I was thinking about the word container, about having a container, the symbolism of having a container. And I believe like Christ has been that container for many people in the West, and maybe what your thoughts about that was. And also about Jung. I don't know, I think I was reading a book recently on Jung, and apparently he believed that Christ was was a god, that he wasn't a man, or he wasn't born a man, he was born a god. So I don't know, any thoughts on that? Yeah, I've got 14 seconds left. I think that's it really.
You don't have to use it all. That's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. So yeah, I so I really like, so the idea of a container is huge. There's like an image that kind of has struck me recently about how, we're sort of in the cosmos itself is this kind of hermetic vessel, right? And that we're in it, and the walls of the vessel are like the constellations of in the stars, and like we're in this vessel with the other planets and the sun, the moon, and all just sort of participating in this grand, divine drama. The container, Wilson said bottles are a symbol, and bottles are a container, right? The container is a feminine symbol, right? And so it's important, like I've had dreams recently about like missing a shoe, or like, and shoes are a container, right? They connect a person to the ground, which is another feminine symbol. So I think it's all very interesting as far as Christ being a container. I think that I think that dogma itself is somewhat of a container. Whether we believe in it or not, even is just that it's a place where we can sort of categorize our conceptions and like find meaning in this disarray of like symbols and experiences and everything that we have. And I think the church will often present a container that and the 12-step fellowships do this as well, right? It's a place where we can come in and we can sort of apply their definition of what our experience has been, and it feels like a safe place. I do want to say this. So Jung often says interesting things regarding mythological figures. But I don't know that Jung, because in the quote we just read earlier today, he talks about the concrete Rabbi Jesus versus the archetype that this human being sort of became a reflection of or whatever. So, and that the later theologians like Paul and John, they were the ones who had really grabbed hold of the archetype of the Messiah or of the anointed one, and sort of formulated that with dogma versus like the man Jesus, who may have been aware that there was such a thing, right? But that he, it's this whole thing about the historicity of Jesus and stuff. It's a really big conversation, and Jung was very well versed in it, and he and he did have Jung did have different perspectives, and he said many different things about the man Jesus. Thank you, Duncan. Am I rambling today? I love it. I'll take it.
Not a lot more than usual, a little bit
Okay.
more than usual. Lamont,
hot
come
in
on
here.
in. Come on in, Lamont. We like you said, we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, let me
today.
in here. My name is Lamont the Mountie. You understand? Let me bloviate a little bit. I'm made in the image and likeness of God. I'm perfect. Don't get the headache now. I am that I am because I can exercise my willpower all I want. That's not ego either. That's just me being balanced. It's a lot to talk about on this, you understand? And it's all good. My question to you is, and I'm gonna make it. Wait. I got some time tomorrow. Slow down. It's all right. I'm used to going to minute meetings and 2-minute meetings, so I know how to drop the mic. Bill W. and Pass It On had a bright idea to use LSD to deflate the ego. That was in chapter 23 of Pass It On. He had a bright idea. I'm like, wow. So he thought that using LSD would be a great way to deflate the ego, just showing you how cunning and baffling the disease is. But my question to you, and don't ask it now, let me get my full 90 seconds. But I know how to talk in 90 seconds. Are you perfect? You understand? Do you consider yourself made in the image and likeness of God like I am? I know a lot of folks say I'm not perfect and all that, but outside of the ego, when it's balanced between those two extremes of heaven and hell, right and wrong, I don't get all off into that. For me, my main objective is to stay balanced, because when you're dealing with alcoholics, you're dealing with their dis-ease, and it can be quite intense. So let me go on and drop the mic. Peace. Are you perfect?
All right, Lamont, thank you for the question. I love that question. I don't think I've ever been asked. I mean, my wife has asked me that, but kind of sarcastically,
No, I haven't.
She says, no, I haven't. Am I perfect? I mean, yes, I'm perfect, but so is, the flower that's going to wilt later today because it's so hot. I don't know how to really answer that question. I don't really adhere to like religious dogmas, but I do enjoy mythology. And so I feel like the goal is, for me, the goal is not perfection. The goal is wholeness and a more fuller awareness or a deeper kind of conscious connection with the unconscious. If anything is perfect, it would be the psyche, but the psyche is so grand and paradoxical. It's both evil and good. And so, I think that I think that for me, I think for me, perfection is maybe leans a little too heavily towards one side of a juxtaposition of opposites, if that makes sense. How'd I do on the time that time, Duncan?
I don't have time to comment. Sende, come on in. Sende? I'm not hearing anything from you. You're unmuted, but no sound is coming through. Let's go to Nova. We'll try you again, Sende. Nova cannot, you're still muted.
There we go. You
Hi,
got it.
am I unmuted now? Yes. Hi, thank you. Cody, thank you. I must say it is there's a lot of intellect in it, so I really had to do my best sometimes to understand it, but I got the core message for me. And it's really interesting because today I had my second day of therapy, group therapy, and well, you were saying talking about wholeness, more conscious connection. The other side of addiction is connection. So today we got a class of how you can give other people feedback through the feedback rules. So how you can do that in an assertive way, so the other person receives my message. But I was wondering, if I look at it in the non-violent communication style, I really miss something, because being assertive and giving feedback, it is communication, so that is with the other person, but it was really fine-tuned on how you communicate yourself towards the other person without even confirming that you heard the other, as one of the most, also a very important part. Even if you don't agree, even if you disagree completely, it is just like standing still, like I want to tell you how something comes across, and how I feel about it, and how I would wish you to change your behavior towards me. But I also mentioned it. So how come that we missed the part that I give confirmation to the other person, even if I just say, I've heard you, I heard what you said, I understand your point, but I don't agree. How do you look at it?
So I really like this question, and I love this conversation. It's a conversation that I have very often with my friends about communication and just being in a relationship. And I can just give you kind of a personal anecdote, or personal story. So, and because this is something that I've had to come to terms with in my own relationships, is that oftentimes when people are telling me something that has to do with our relationship, like depending on the attitude that they bring to the conversation, I may or may not accept what they have to say. And yet it is quite possible and usually probable that my own behavior has caused them to feel anger. And so they are telling me something about myself and they're doing it angrily, and my initial reaction to that is usually to go on the defense and be like, whoa, check yourself, like you better call your spot or whatever. When the truth is, like, I owe it to myself and to the people in my life to try to listen to whatever their complaints are. Like, and this may or may not fit for everybody that's here, but for me in my life, in the relationships that I have, it behooves me to listen to what they have to say, because I'm actually becoming more and more aware of the fact that, like, my wife, for instance, she has some really good insights about the things that I could do in my life to live a more full and successful existence, and that if I'm always defensive, I won't be able to hear what she's saying. And so I've made it a point for me to just really try to listen to when people are offering me feedback, even if they're mad at me. And I found it to be a pretty interesting exercise. So that's how I respond to that.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Thank you, Nova. Thank you. Let's try Sende again. Sende, can you, asking you to unmute? Not happening. Okay, I have a question in the chat. Oh, keeps jumping around. Here it is. In an early chapter talking about spiritual bypass, you made a comment about the severe negative impact of this on a young person. I had a near-death experience at 16, which led me on a journey on which was driven to have that experience, which I did on occasion, but the shadow work, the emotional depth, the childhood trauma was never addressed. Would you please expand on that?
I'll try. So I appreciate you sharing. I don't know exactly which experience that regarding the spiritual bypass, but I can comment on the spiritual bypass. And just to maybe reiterate is that yes, I think that we have a tendency, all of us, no matter where we are, is to spiritual bypass. I mean, my whole thing is and I've just been reading about this the other day, is that for a person of my type, you know, what feels the best to me is sort of these really lofty ideas, this kind of esoteric spiritual kind of thing. Like, I just want to get in this zone, I want to drink my coffee and just sort of like float away, right? But that's the stuff that comes the easiest for me. And so if I'm always leaning towards what feels the best in terms of my own spiritual growth, then there's the problem that a person like me will have of literally floating away. It's the Peter Pan thing, right? And so my goal for me, and what's interesting about this is that the self has now created a situation in my life where I'm having to focus on the things that I consider to be far more mundane and sort of below what I should be spending my time doing. But and there's actually, at this point, there's no way around it, right? Like, this is just the nature of life now for me. And so my spiritual sort of attitude and perspective, and my practice, like really recently, just like right now, like today, and is just that there's much to learn, to be involved in these actions as well, and that they are perhaps even more powerful and instructive to me than the flying away part, right? That because it's so, I just don't like it, right? It's so it's the thing I don't want to do. It's that whole thing we talk about in the 12 steps, is that contrary action, right? And so when it comes to the way we approach spirituality, we want to learn how to find that balance and do the things that go contrary to what what feels the most natural. Because, like in my case, right, I'm an intuitive thinking type, and so people like me tend to float away, right? And so the spiritual bypass is literally like, I just float right over all my problems until eventually they pile up to a certain point where I can't really float over them anymore, and I have to literally dig through them and sort them out. So thank you.
Thank you, Kayla.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Cody. Yeah, I've got kind of a get down to group grassroots question. So I'm wondering on what you do, if you do anything to become aware of what's in your unconscious, you know, in relation to your alcoholism, especially, and any techniques you found. I thought maybe mindfulness might be one, but I'm not sure if that would work.
I'm
so
sorry, it broke up just a little bit. I missed like a key point of what your question was.
Hold on, I'll go to another room that's clearer.
You're fine. You're fine, Kayla. It's Cody. I heard everything clearly. Go ahead, Kayla.
yeah, I'm just wondering how you become aware of what's in your unconscious mind, if you come across any techniques or experience yourself of what's going on in your unconscious, to become aware of what's going on in the unconscious in relation to, especially to your alcoholism or drug addiction.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, you know, it's really, it's such an interesting journey, right? Because for me, like the whole sort of debacle that is step one, right? That in my case was like you know, was a it took 20 or 25 years for it to play out, this insoluble dilemma, what Wilson called an impossible dilemma. That really was at its root a question of the ego versus the self, and this coming to terms with an unconscious component, right? And I make the statement in the book somewhere that like even like to become aware of one's unconscious compulsions, even for one who is addicted, is one of the greatest leaps in consciousness that we can make. You know, and the reason I say that is because I don't think alcoholics and drug addicts, for example, are like stupid. I actually think quite the opposite. I think most alcoholics and drug addicts that I know are like really, really smart. And yet they still can't see that they're suffering from this delusion, right? Because it's still unconscious. So that in itself, you know, the message there is that the self, right, that this thing we're calling the self now, the self has as its goal to make itself known to the ego. And the way it does this is by introducing these insoluble psychological conflicts that actually manifest in what Patrick had mentioned, unmanageability, right? That's the essence of step one. It's not that I'm powerless, it's that it made my life unmanageable, and that our life is unmanageable, right? And the self, right, this unconscious component in us is the one who's masterminding that whole situation, right? So that's how it happens in step one. When I get to step two, step three, step four, step five, what happens is that the ego then becomes aware, like, oh shit, like I'm not actually in charge here. And then it sort of is like, oh no, like what am I supposed to do now, right? And there's this kind of like, there's this awakening that it's like, wow, I don't have the answers. And so then I turn towards other people, and I become, the relationship that I have with people changes, and now I'm asking them to tell me about myself, right? Because those are also things that I can't see. So when I do this, I'm engaging in some shadow work, right? When I do the 4th step, the 5th step, the 8th step, the 9th step, I'm getting feedback from the world about those parts of myself or my personality that I can't see, and that really is at its base shadow work. Then I do step 11 and I start to meditate. Right now, I'm doing more of this making the unconscious conscious, because I'm trying to connect to this transcendent power, right? That is essentially an unconscious power, right? And so maybe I can learn to feel the power, and sort of channel the power. That's another way I engage in making the unconscious conscious. There's also this other kind of process that was a big, you know, that Jung was a huge component of, was just doing dream work, right? Every time we dream, the unconscious is trying to make itself conscious. So we can look at dreams, we can look at myths, we can try to relate to those, to dreams and myths, like in our own sort of in our own way, right? To try to see, like, we're going to talk about the fall, the Garden of Eden next week, and hopefully what we can see from that is our own story being told in there, right? Of our relationship to the self, the ego's consciousness, the way consciousness relates to the self, and the way the self implements this sort of plan, to create these situations where the ego just runs out of options. So yeah, all of the above are good ways to connect.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kayla. Thank you, Cody. Wow. Okay, so oops, I forgot to turn on the timer now that it's my turn. The self that you're talking about here, I'll put the timer on. I'm just goofing around. The self that you're talking about here is very similar to this concept of the self in internal family systems. There was a great talk here at Friendly Circle Berlin from Robert Falconer yesterday, where he was talking about this. And I really appreciated your presentation about this. You seem to be really hot about this latter part of the book. I mean, this latter part of the book, part 4, seems more important to you than lunch. And prior to this week, lunch was more important to you than carrying on. So what's my question? Because I don't have to use all my time here. You mentioned there's sometimes a second surrender. And when you said that, I thought, what is wrong with me? I've had at least 274 surrenders just, this year. What's wrong with me? Well, how many surrenders is it possible to have? Some people have 2. What's the max? Thank you.
Well, to answer the real question, what's wrong with you? I would need a whole seminar just for that.
Okay, we'll add a 23rd session on that's your critique of me. All right, we'll look forward to that, folks.
Well, I mean, I agree, right? Like we all have multiple surrenders, and the ego's forever trying to assert its autonomy in terms of, and I love the quote from Edinger that we read where because he lists all the ways in which the ego, or some of the ways in which the ego can become inflated, right? And those are all ways that I can relate to pretty much almost, any old day at a certain point. So, and so I think that, and Jung says that the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. And so anytime the ego comes up against, an image of the self or a concept or, a challenging dream or a myth or just anything that the ego doesn't understand or whatever it is, those are always a defeat for the ego. Because the ego is really chained to this world of rationale and things that it can understand and control. The ego always will suffer from a delusion of control, and the self will always be tending towards basically destroying that delusion. And I think that I mean, for me personally, like I've recently had another surrender, like what I was just talking about. The way my life had been really kind of situated was I was able to essentially write a book. It took me 5 years. I had work, but I was able to really just work from home, and our company just kind of ran itself, and like things were really great. And then all of a sudden, over the last 12 months, like business has changed dramatically to where now I have to go out and do a lot of the work myself, and I'm answering the phones. And so this was all stuff we used to have multiple people doing, whereas now it's all really landing on me and Ming. And so this is a surrender, right? And the process for me is to really even the nature of my dreams have changed, right? They're more kind of harrowing now. There's like these scary moments, like and harrowing, sorry. And it all sort of so but this is good, right? Because it's forcing me to work a spiritual program in a situation where I'm not exactly excited about it, and that I can just trust and rely on whatever wisdom it was who created this situation for me. There's something even deeper in this for me to uncover than there is, again, like soaring into great heights, right? Like I need to be going into the depths more. So yes, thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Cody. We're coming closer to the 2-hour mark, and we have one more question from Sarah. Can you wait for lunch just for another minute, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, we're good. I'm not hungry today. Don't worry.
Not
We're
hungry today. Oh. Sarah, come on in.
Hey, thank you for letting me squeeze in at the end. The last line on the last paragraph that you had, the last two words were, it's something about the ego and it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
So is too late death?
Well, yes, it actually is. That the reference there is and maybe it's not always death, right? That but that and I'll just read it so everyone can see. It says, still recognizing one's powerlessness even over alcohol or drugs is almost as hard as it is for us to sense our intangible thirst for union with God. The ego resists making the connection sometimes until it's too late. And yeah, so certainly, you know, in the 12-step fellowships and in NA or AA or, you know, CA or HA, there's a lot of the too late really does you know, result in death, sadly, right? We just become really almost immune to it. You know, it still hurts, but it's I mean, I saw a guy post today on Facebook that he lost a friend, and the post was very simply, oh, hey, you know, he posted on the guy's page. He just said, hey, man, I heard we lost you. You know, like, oh, that's too bad. My heart goes out to your family. So we become really sort of, you know, almost desensitized to it. You know, regardless of how painful it really is. So yes, and I think that just the nature of how dangerous this situation is, and which we see in certain 12-step fellowships, you know, is that it is that the self is playing for keeps. You know, the self is willing to risk all of this collateral damage just to make itself conscious. I think there's something really profound in that message, right? And as we go through the next few chapters, we're going to talk more and more about this. But that there's something so important that's trying to manifest here that it's willing to risk our lives, right? And us, you know, people like us, we've been called to this thing to a certain degree that most of the rest of the world doesn't really know much about. You know, Jung understood it. You know, he had clients would commit suicide and stuff sometimes, and so it was clear, like, there is sometimes this work is just too dangerous for everybody. So yes, that's what that refers to. Thanks for your question.
Thanks.
Is that all that's all? Is that all the questions? Well, oh, no, it's not. Terry? What before you share, Terry, I just want to say that what we're talking about here in this last couple of questions, Cody, is like, I'm the little boy with a stuffed animal, and I have to decide if I'll trust the spirit realm to trade my stuffed animal for a real puppy.
Mm.
And I'm afraid to let go of my stuffed animal, but if I do, I get a real puppy. Come on in, Terry.
Hi. It kind of, you know, like listening in, and it's like that experience of feeling like the hole in the donut. And it is like, you know, I've had serial ego deaths and then space for something else to kind of move in. And, you know, I was just, you know, curious, like, because I like the parts work so much, because I feel I used to try to access dreams, but doing the parts work, really accessing all, not necessarily the shadows, but the things that aren't necessarily so easily seen within the conscious realm, you can access through the inner work by turning inside yourself. Have you experienced any of that, you know, Cody? Because sometimes when you look at the parts, then there's space for more to enter. And I feel that that's by emptying ourselves in sobriety, something else new can enter besides just an ego run wild. There's more to life in us and our souls, and so, and that, then I like the concept of self that you said, but that there's something just more than ego, and that seems to be the process with this shadow work. Yes.
I mean, yes, that there is more than just the ego, right? And that the ego is really just such a small component of the self. Um, and it's really powerless in the face of the self. Um, and it's really, driven to behave and I mean, I love the word driven. That was a word that both Carl Jung used as well as Bill Wilson, right? And I know for me, I'm very often driven, so and I think that understanding what we're trying to get at here in these classes, and of course the parts work, um it's probably doing pretty much the same thing, right? But it's to really try to understand the nature of what is driving us, right? And that we're and what we're doing here, that slowly sort of kind of we're trying to kind of grow or cultivate or whatever, is that this thing that's driving us is, we call it the self, right? But the self is synonymous with the God image. And that underlying this whole conversation is the notion of this paradoxical God image, right? And we want to understand our images of light, right? But that there's something that even those images have shadows. And what does that mean for us, right? Like, I love this because we get to ask all the really hard questions that you can't ask in church, and find logical answers to them, and hopefully deepen our experience. So
I've got a question. Thank you. I've got a question from the chat. Hi, Cody and Duncan. Thank you so much for your service. I took your amazing advice last class and began tracking my dreams and symbols that have come about. You mentioned last time that you'd be open to analyzing our dreams. Are you still open to that? And can we have your contact to submit? And second question, can you give more resource tools to set up for ourselves to embark on understanding our dreams? I'm very excited of what has been in my dreams as of late and feel blessed with this work. Thank you again.
yes. So yes, Michelle. What I so I won't be able to give you, what I did say last week was that I'm happy to try to help you get started in analyzing your dreams, and I can turn you on to some different resources where you can um begin to look at the symbols. So I'm really excited about that. My email address, so a really easy way to find me is to go on my website, cody-peterson.com, and you can submit a form, or you can just email me directly. My email address is alkyarchetype@gmail.com. And I'll put it in the chat, or maybe
It's in the chat.
sometimes okay. Yeah. So please reach out. If I don't respond, and I have a couple messages from people and I keep them new in there, but I've just been so busy the last 2 weeks. So if I lag on responding, like, please don't lose hope. It's just that I'm waiting till I have time to like sit down and really make a good response. But I would love to see your dreams, and I can only do like a preliminary thing, but what I can and try to do is just get you pointed in the right direction. So which I'm definitely interested in doing. So
Thanks. Come on in, Victoria. We're going to go till Cody gets hungry.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep it brief because I have too many questions to ask in 90 seconds. So instead, maybe what I'll do is address more of just something that comes up while you're talking, of course, but then in Duncan's question about, only to, the language that's being used to describe these awakenings or these levels of consciousness, this is the problem with language, right? We're constantly discussing it. I think Jung is very often attempting to describe things that are so complex that all he can do is say it's two. Instead of saying it's two, to the infinite power of finally when you get there, because that's clunky. So I guess I imagine that you run up against the limitations of language a lot in trying to describe this awakening that we come to this planet or to this existence to experience. And we're lucky enough, and I think this is sometimes what we're trying to talk about, is that we're lucky enough to have hit a wall where all the usual means are exhausted. And that's the 12-step. That's when some of us reach for a 12-step program. Anyway, I thank you so much for everything you've offered. And hopefully we'll get to chat in person, and I'll be able to formulate my 20 questions, or to the exponential power.
Yeah, I mean that is it, right? It's that, and I find it fascinating that we have these really profound and just gargantuan, like, religious systems of symbols and stories, and from all different cultures, and all trying to describe this thing, right? It's almost as if, like, all of language is meant to point to this thing that none of us can describe, and that we can feel and we can sense, and some of us have had experiences, and it's really a profound idea, concept. Yes. And one thing that does strike me, though, is that there is this language of symbolism, right? That is such a good, you know, I guess the point is that the unconscious speaks in symbolism, right? And so the symbols are these things that they describe it better than anything else, right? Because the symbols they also can undergo, like, an infinite number of translations or of interpretations, right? So that symbolical language is very useful. I read something this week from Jung where he said that the only statements that have any validity regarding the God image are paradoxical. So I think that really gets to the heart of the matter, right? So this symbolical language is by nature paradoxical, which makes it really difficult for the ego to understand. But that's the self, right? The self is a paradox. So thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks, Cody. Drexel's back. What you got?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can be heard.
Yes, I hear you.
I've got a lot of atmospheric and meteorological interference, and aircraft flying overhead, and children out in the playground screaming. But the idea that I appreciate this platform and venue and this discussion. The idea that I was an altar boy and studying to become a priest, got drafted to go to Nam. So all the choices I was making weren't transpiring. So I'm not sure what that does to affect a person's ego, personality, or even understanding of their relationship with the world around them. To become one with versus one of. I know I studied, I'm a scriptural scout. So he said to Moses, tell him that I am that I am, which can translate to mean I am that you heard of, or I am that I am because I say I am. But when he got to Pharaoh Pharaoh said, who sent you with this? And he said, I am sent me. Don't you know who I am is? So then we get into grammar as far as understanding how we express whatever we're doing. Is that understanding or lack thereof the actually yin yang that we're dealing with, even in the spiritus versus spiritum? And that the idea that we have to embrace rather than collide our separation or connection, that understanding thereof. So with all that wisdom, get understanding. Is that the message that you kind of researching and sharing with us?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I think it is. It is the the yin yang, the paradox, the um because really everything that I can think of is really separated into these opposites, right? Except for the one thing that's that thing that we can't describe. So, but I mean everything else, I think is a paradox. So, yeah. Thanks.
Sarah?
Thank you. And can I
Thank
get
you,
your
Phil.
number? I'd like to share
Yeah,
more.
I'll send it over.
Okay. Thank you. And thank
Whoops, sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, so Cody, I just wanted to ask you one or make another comment. So, if I've tasted an orange, I can yearn and long for the taste of an orange. But if I've never tasted an orange, I'm not going to long for an orange, right? And I remember I was in a therapy session and I said to my therapist, there's a deep longing and yearning that I have had within me all my life. And I can't possibly be yearning and longing for something that I have not known. And for me, it feels to me like, yes, my relationships can bring me a certain level of comfort and connectedness, but the real deep yearning and longing for me seems to me to be the yearning and longing from where I came from where we all come from. And I'm not a religious person, but it just feels like at some point there was a deep union with something greater than me that I experienced, that I carry with me now. And I'm not an alcoholic, but I am in the food program, and it's just finding those substitutes to fill that yearning that can't be filled by anything of this world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think even from like a biological standpoint, right? We have been one, right? And then we split into two cells, and then right. So there is this sort of underlying unity that we are trying to really get back to. And that the so I think that we experience this in terms of our myths. We also kind of all, I think I do, at least I think, I sort of like look back to like, oh, what must it have been like to live 5,000 years ago before there was pollution or whatever. Like it's just this sort of this fantasy about how good things used to be, right? Like that it's this longing to find that wholeness that we clearly descended from. And so I think yes, I think that that's all part of this whole conversation about wholeness and the conjunctio, about the psychological split, right, that became so apparent when Jesus emerged as a mythological symbol. All of this stuff is really it's funny because it all boils down to like this single sort of thing, right? And it's just all these different ways of describing it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
I just wanted to bring up close to a quote, as I can get it, that seems to apply to a lot of stuff that's gone on in the discussions today. And I think it's in Ion someplace, but Jung says that whenever we're faced with an insoluble problem, when there's appear to be two solutions and you can't figure out which one of them is right, that if one waits and holds them, that something called the creative third will appear at some point, and there will be a solution, even though it's not what we might expect or long for, look for. I've always found great hope in, and it has worked in my life when faced with a dilemma to just wait. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I like that. That seems like really good advice. And it is the, you know, the thing too with that this kind of irrational third thing, right? That which is the it's Mercurius, right? The child of the sun and the moon, the paradoxical hermaphroditic, you know, third thing.
Sorry, that wasn't for you. You can talk as long as you want.
No problem. I think I'm talked out. I think I've talked for about 2 hours straight.
That was the end of Philip's question asking time. You look how concise he was. I applaud you, sir. Cody, I'm sorry I interrupted you, please.
No, you're good. You're good. So I am getting hungry. I am getting hungry now.
He's hungry, folks. He's hungry. All right, let's make it so that everybody can unmute here. I think, yeah, oh, I already did that. Thank you so much, Cody, for talking with us again today. Next week will be chapter 15. These are all recorded and on Cody's website and on Friendly Circle Berlin. Shall we close with the Serenity Prayer? Yes.